Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. The story from American history that probably gets mythologized more than any other story, definitely shows up in elementary and middle school history books, is the story of the Wright brothers. Here you have two brothers who never left home. They were high school dropouts. They made a living as bicycle mechanics, but somehow they figured out the secret of manned flight at a time when the top physicists around the world were trying to crack the same code. Now, the Wright brothers have been treated in a lot of popular books as basically one organism. They were both equally responsible for sorting out the technical problems of flight. They were equally responsible for working out the complex physics. And when you read a history book about them, they're basically treated as the same person. There's very little to distinguish the two from one another. But according to a new book, that's not exactly the case. Today I'm speaking with William Hazelgrove, who's the author of the book Wright Brothers, Wrong Story: How Wilbur Wright Solved the Problem of Manned Flight. William argues that it was Wilbur who designed the first successful airplane, not Orville. While Orville was important and he was there at Kitty Hawk, he generally followed his brother's lead and assisted with the mechanical details to make Wilbur's vision a reality. So William looked through all sorts of archives and family letters and saw that William, when he had a problem with physics, didn't consult Orville, but consulted others. And if we think of Orville as a scribe, William was the poet, the one with the actual vision to make it happen. So in this discussion, we get into all the reasons why history has said that the two of these brothers were equally responsible, how Orville commissioned an autobiography that made the two of them co-equals. So anyway, we get into a discussion of early flight, technology in the early 20th century, and trying to humanize two people that have been spoken of in such legendary accounts. They're more mythological figures than people most of the time. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with William Hazelgrove. William, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
First of all, before we get into your revisionist take on the Wright brothers, what prompted you to want to return to this story and present your take on it?
Well, actually, as a kid, I'm from Virginia, and we used to go to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, for our vacation, believe it or not. We had a cottage there. And I went to that memorial more times than I can count with my parents. And, as a kid, I was like, okay, the Wright brothers and all that. Well, then I read David McCullough's book. And, again, he's a great historian, really admire him and everything. But after I finished his book, I wanted more, and I felt like I knew the Wright story already. And this is sort of this Wright myth, the Wright brothers myth. And I was like, who are these guys? Who are they really? Because, there's sort of these sawdust characters, these sort of figures in history with their derbies and their high collars and, the story, they just went down there, these two guys who were bike mechanics, and built the plane, it flew, and that's the end of the story. But we've never really gotten to know the ins and outs of who the Wright brothers are. And so that really sent me along wanting to, create a book that really told the real story of the Wright brothers. And, because I sniffed that there was something else there. And there was. And that's really, McCullough's book was sort of a springboard for me.
Yeah, and before we reconstruct, I'd like to deconstruct. So could you tell me, what is this common myth that you always hear that McCullough parrots about the Wright brothers that you try to dismantle?
Okay, sure. Actually, it started with Fred Kelly.
Okay.
Fred Kelly was a biographer who, here's what happened. In 1912, Wilbur Wright died. Okay. So this left a vacuum because his brother, Orville, would live until 1948. And so there's this big, long gap in history. But Orville was very reluctant to write any kind of biography or authorize any kind of biography of the Wright brothers. There was a guy named Fred Kelly. Now, Fred Kelly was a very good friend of Orville's. And, guys like Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh and other people were on Orville saying, you've got to do this. You've got to have this biography. And so finally he said to Fred Kelly, I'll tell you what, you can write the book, but I'm going to approve every single page. And many times Orville wanted to stop it. He would call up Kelly and go, I don't want to do this anymore. And Kelly would talk him back into it. So when this book finally came out, and by the way, the name of it was The Wright Brothers, a biography authorized by Orville Wright. When this book finally came out, it became the Bible of the Wright brothers. But in fact, this book was Orville's take on what happened. And it was more Orville's story. And, we'll get into the whole, division of talent. But, when you read this thing, literally, I think Wilbur's name appears 267 times. Orville's name appears 400 in it. So there's this skewed Bible that every historian since has used as a jumping off point. And although it's through McCullough. And what this basically says is it's a sort of a boilerplate story. Two brothers, they became fascinated with flight when their dad brought home a little helicopter that, flew up to the ceiling. And they were sort of inventors. They both dropped out of high school. Neither brother ever moved out of the home. Neither brother ever married. They built a printing press. They have a bike shop. They make their own bikes. They're bike mechanics. They both become interested in flight. They both build a glider, and they go down to Kitty Hawk 4 times. And by 1903, they crack the code of flight. And the first 12 seconds of flight occurs on December 17th, 1903, with Orville at the in the pilot seat. And that is what's been handed down with the famous photo at the end taken by John Tate on December 17, 1903. So that's the boilerplate of the Wright story, and it has not really deviated.
And one other thing, too, with this authorized biography and the David McCullough story, in the authorized biography, does Orville treat he and Wilbur as basically this symbiotic creature, this Vulcan mind meld, where, yes, it's two people, but for all intents and purposes, they're treated as one organism? Does he tell the story like that?
Exactly. And this goes all the way back to their father, Milton Wright. Milton Wright was a bishop, and he believed the world was inherently evil. So he told his 2 sons and his daughter, Catherine, look, don't go out in the world. The only thing you can trust is the family, and we have to present a united front. So nobody could ever step out and say, I'm different. And so Orville, this was the mantra when Wilbur was alive, so this sort of sealed up the Wright story. But when Orville went to, have this biography written, yes, it was, they walked the same, they talked the same, they were equal partners in the development of the airplane, except actually, if you read it, it makes it sound more like Orville had more to do with it than Wilbur did. There's key scenes where Kelly puts him, and let's face it, Orville's the guy paying Kelly, and he's approving every single page. So if Orville doesn't like something, it's not going to fly. So this was never, intended in Orville's mind to be this sort of, tell the real story. This was intended to be a, look, we were equal, period. And that's what's presented to the world.
Yeah, and that's a good 101 class to our listeners about historiography, to always cross-examine your sources and question where this is coming from and what are the agendas of people producing sources. And before we get into the invention of flight and the role that Wilbur and Orville each individually played, could you describe a little bit about this world of the 1890s, the 1900s, in which they're trying to invent an aircraft? Because a lot of us, I think, assume that, all scientists agree that human flight was impossible, and anyone who was trying it was this black and white footage of people in flying suits and bird or bat suits with that blooper music playing in the background, and these crackpots trying to do stuff. So what is this world in the 1890s, 1900s when they're trying to invent an airplane?
Well, you're partially right. Flying to a lot of people was sort of like going to the moon. So it did bring in a lot of crackpots, and that's those crazy films we see of, the things, the cars with wings and people running off cliffs and everything else. Now, saying that, Samuel Langley, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian, he was the man who was trying to crack flight. So he goes down with Alexander Graham Bell one day in 1896 to a boat called the Ark, and he shoots off this boat a model, a steam-powered model that he had built, under the auspices of the Smithsonian. So this was scientific, right? Well, the first model goes off this boat in the Potomac while, Alexander Graham Bell and everybody's watching. The thing just goes down into the water. So Langley's horrified. He has one more. They launch the second one. It goes down below the deck of the boat. They don't see it, and Langley thinks, oh, my God, the thing went back down into the water. All of a sudden, it rises up and flies around the boat in this big, long arc. Looks like a big steam bug, right? Just sort of going around. Well, it lands in the water, and everybody's like, Langley cracked the code of flight. Okay, in 1896, all I have to do is build a bigger model. Well, the government comes in and says, we could probably use these for war. Here's $50,000 they give the Smithsonian to develop the bigger model. So Langley is the man. He is the anointed guy, the secretary of the Smithsonian, who's going to crack flight. Right? So everything's on him. Now, you have this guy, Wilbur Wright, and we'll talk about his role quickly, but soon, but who's down in Kitty Hawk. Nobody knows who this guy is. He's a bike mechanic, and yet he too is going after this Rubik's Cube of flight to try and crack it. And there's guys like Lilienthal, who was a German who would put on wings on his back and run off cliffs in Germany. And Lilienthal actually was known as the Flying Man. And Lilienthal would fly around kicking his feet one way or that way to navigate. Okay, but here's the thing. Nobody understands the physics of flight. We can talk about it in a minute. They don't understand lift coefficients. Lilienthal doesn't understand stall either, or even wind shear, which he encountered. So one day Lilienthal goes off his cliff, and then he goes straight down, breaks his neck, and dies. But in fact, he was the cutting edge at that time of flight. Meanwhile, Langley's trying to build his plane, and the Wright brothers, or Wilbur, is just beginning to, get the bug of flying.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because it almost seems like there's a mini space race happening on who can achieve flight. And the flying man you described sounds silly, but really a lot of them are using the same principle where they look at the physics of a bird and think, how do we apply this to a machine, since a bird is obviously heavier than air? And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't one of the Wright brothers, when Langley died, really stick up for him and say he wasn't foolhardy for his machine because scientific progress happens through rigorous trial and error? Do I have that correct? Yeah,
and actually it's probably a good time to segue off of that and go into how Wilbur got into this.
Right.
Wilbur's 17. He's playing hockey down the street, a guy named Crookshank. And Crookshank is like the neighborhood bully. He's high on, believe it or not, cocaine drops because he's got bad teeth. Turns out later he's a drug user. And here's the bishop's boy. He's headed for, you believe it or not, Wilbur's headed for Yale, of all places. Okay, he's on a totally different path. Oliver Crookshank raises up his stick and smashes Wilbur's jaw, just decimates it. Wilbur, is severely hurt. He goes into his house, and he has all these complications from it. At the same time, his mother's dying. He goes into a 3-year depression. During this depression, he begins to read books on flight. Also during this time, Lilienthal died, and this really affected Wilbur because he had followed Lilienthal. Wilbur is a fish out of water. He's actually like a writer and artist. He doesn't really like the bike shop. It doesn't really engage him, and this is all in the book. He's sort of a man who has a greater vision, and he has a fantastic brain. He's intellectually, in terms of engineering, he has a great ability, but it hasn't been challenged yet. So at the end of this 3-year journey into the dark night of the soul, where his mother dies, and he literally doesn't come out of the house, he reads and reads and reads, and at the end of that, he writes to the Smithsonian, okay, and says, do you have any pamphlets? Do you have any pamphlets on flying? They send him back the latest pamphlets on flying. And then he contacts Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, or rather the Weather Bureau, and says, do you know of any place that has constant wind? And they send him back a bunch of places, and one of them is Kitty Hawk. Now, he takes the known data of the time and builds Wilbur at this point, because this is Wilbur. Wilbur builds a kite, sort of a flying wing, all right, But he also comes up with a concept that after twisting the ends of a